In the aftermath of a brutal and relentless retreat, a lone German soldier trudged through the desolate landscape, every step a reflection of the broken world around him. His boots, worn and frayed from days of ceaseless marching, sank into the mud, as the ground itself seemed to reject the presence of the soldiers who had once stormed through this land with iron resolve. Now, everything was different. The roaring echoes of artillery had faded into a hollow silence, a silence so thick it seemed to suffocate all hope. The soldier, barely a man anymore, was left to confront the overwhelming reality of his own despair. His uniform, once a symbol of pride and power, now clung to his frame in tatters. The insignia that had once marked him as a member of an elite fighting force were now little more than faded patches, and the crisp lines of his once immaculate uniform were stained with dirt, blood, and the grime of war. His rifle, too, felt like an extension of his exhaustion rather than a tool of strength. It hung loosely in his grip, as if it had lost all purpose. His mind was fogged, not by the physical exhaustion alone but by a deeper, more consuming fatigue, the emotional weariness of knowing that the war was slipping away from him and from his comrades. He was a German infantryman, a soldier who had fought with fervor in the early days, believing in the righteousness of his cause, in the certainty of victory. But now, after months of unimaginable suffering, he was disillusioned. The tides of the war were turning, and the enemy forces, once distant shadows on the horizon, were now closing in with terrifying speed. His comrades had fallen one by one, some in the heat of battle, others to the slow and painful death that seemed inevitable in these circumstances. The soldier had seen the horrors of war firsthand, the destruction, the bloodshed, the madness that gripped both sides, and had begun to question whether there was any true sense to this endless cycle of violence. He had been separated from his unit during the chaos of a failed counteroffensive. He could no longer recall the exact moment it had happened, when the organized lines of battle had dissolved into confusion and panic. The sound of gunfire, the cries of wounded men, the explosion of bombs that rattled the very bones of the earth, they had all blurred together in a cacophony of horror. In the midst of it, he had found himself alone, disconnected from his comrades, separated by a wall of gunfire and chaos. For a moment, he had frozen, unsure whether to push forward or retreat. But before he could decide, the ground beneath him had shifted, the enemy forces overtaking the position, leaving him with no choice but to run. Now, here he was, walking through the ruins of a once thriving village. The skeletal remains of buildings loomed over him like the ghosts of the past, remnants of a world that had been shattered by the very conflict he had participated in. He could hear the wind whisper through the broken windows of abandoned homes, the only sound that accompanied his weary footsteps. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. The soldier's mind raced, filled with fear and uncertainty. What would become of him now? He had no idea where his unit had gone, no idea if they had even survived. The war was coming to an end, but the price had been steep, and the soldier was beginning to feel like a casualty of the final act. As he trudged on, he couldn't help but reflect on the chain of events that had brought him to this point. He had once been so certain of the righteousness of his cause. He had believed in the propaganda that had been fed to him from an early age, the idea of German superiority, of a nation destined to rise again. But now, with his unit scattered, his comrades either dead or captured, and the war slipping into its final, chaotic days, he found himself questioning everything. The world seemed to be crumbling around him, and he was left with nothing but the gnawing feeling that he had been nothing more than a pawn in a game he never truly understood. With each passing minute, his thoughts grew darker, and the weight of what he had witnessed pressed down on him. He had seen men turned into monsters, their humanity stripped away in the pursuit of victory. He had watched as families were torn apart, villages razed to the ground, and children left to wander the ruins of their once vibrant homes. He had been part of it all, an instrument of destruction, carrying out orders without questioning the consequences. And now he was paying the price. He had lost everything: his friends, his faith, his identity, and the prospect of going home, if such a thing were even possible now, seemed increasingly unlikely. As he neared the edge of the village, his eyes caught sight of movement. His heart skipped a beat, and his breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he thought he might have imagined it, but then the figures became clearer, a group of soldiers, walking toward him with purpose. British soldiers. He froze in place, his body stiffening with fear. His mind flashed back to the countless stories of prisoners of war, of men who had been captured and subjected to unimaginable cruelty. His first instinct was to run, to escape, but his legs felt like lead, unwilling to move. The thought of being taken prisoner terrified him. What would they do to him? Would they torture him? Would they shoot him on sight? The British soldiers grew closer, their voices drifting on the wind, but the soldier could not make out their words. He felt his pulse quicken, his palms growing clammy. His thoughts spiraled, imagining every horrific possibility. He was a prisoner now, a defeated man, and in his mind, that meant scorn and punishment. It was what he deserved, wasn't it? He had fought on the wrong side, had carried out the atrocities of the war without question. He could feel the weight of that guilt pressing down on him, the knowledge that his participation in this conflict had only brought suffering. His thoughts turned to his family, back home in Germany, and a pang of regret shot through him. He had promised to return to them, but now, it seemed, that promise would never be kept. The soldiers were closing in, and he could no longer pretend that he was anything but a defeated man, standing alone in the middle of a crumbling world. Then, something strange happened. The British soldiers did not raise their weapons. They did not sneer or shout at him. Instead, they simply stopped, pausing in front of him, their eyes scanning him carefully. The soldier stood motionless, his breath shallow, his chest tight with anxiety. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the uncertainty of what would happen next. He was sure they would execute him, that this was the end. But instead of the scorn he expected, there was only silence, followed by a slight, almost imperceptible lowering of their rifles. The men looked at him, their faces a mixture of weariness and something else he could not place, something he had not expected to see in the eyes of his enemies. It was not hatred. It was not anger. It was something more human, a flicker of empathy in the midst of the madness. The soldier stood trembling in the middle of the road, unsure of what to do. His mind raced, his emotions conflicted. Was this some kind of trick? A game to torment him before his execution? Or was it something else entirely? A sign that the war had finally broken something deeper, something in the hearts of the men who fought it? He could not say. All he knew was that for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was a glimmer of hope, however small, however fleeting. And that was something he had not felt in a long, long time. The British soldiers stood in front of him, their faces unreadable, their eyes scanning his every movement. The soldier could hear the wind whistling through the broken windows of the ruined village and the distant sound of artillery fire in the far-off horizon. His mind raced, processing everything at once, but nothing made sense. His heart pounded in his chest like a drum, a relentless rhythm that seemed to echo through the stillness around him. In his frazzled state, he couldn't decide whether this was the end, his final moments before death, or if something more complicated, something unexpected, was unfolding before him. The presence of these men, their weapons still held but lowered, was a paradox he couldn't wrap his mind around. In that split second, he could feel the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Every wrong decision, every ill-fated moment that had led him to this place, seemed to come crashing down like a wave, washing over him with a suffocating force. He was a soldier who had been caught in the machinery of war, someone who had blindly followed orders, fought battles he didn't fully understand, and witnessed horrors he would never be able to forget. He had been trained for combat, but he had never been prepared for this kind of uncertainty, the kind that gnawed at his gut and made his breath hitch in his throat. The kind that made him wonder if there was a future beyond the battlefield, a life not defined by violence and death. His thoughts swirled in a maelstrom of confusion and fear as he looked at the British soldiers. They were not what he expected. These men, whose faces were etched with the same exhaustion and sorrow that he had come to know in his own comrades, were not charging at him with hatred in their eyes. They did not carry the contempt he had anticipated, nor did they look upon him with the kind of coldness that he had witnessed in countless prisoners of war. Instead, their eyes held a strange mixture of curiosity and something softer, something that struck him as almost tender, something that made no sense in the midst of war. His hands, which had once gripped his rifle with the certainty of a man trained to fight, now hung loosely by his sides, trembling uncontrollably. The weapon seemed like an extension of his fear, a reminder of everything he had lost. The soldier's gaze flicked from one British soldier to the next, trying to read their expressions, to decipher the unsaid words that lingered in the space between them. Were they waiting for him to do something? Were they waiting for him to surrender completely? He had no idea. Everything he had been taught about the enemy, the British, the so-called foe, seemed to crumble in that moment, replaced by an unspoken understanding that he was facing something far more complex than he had imagined. The patrol commander, a man of average build with a face weathered by years of battle, stepped forward slowly. His boots crunched against the debris underfoot, the sound sharp in the stillness. The soldier's breath hitched again, and his mind screamed at him to run, to flee before they had a chance to make a decision about his fate. He thought of the stories he had heard from other soldiers, of the brutal treatment prisoners of war often endured at the hands of their captors. The idea of being taken prisoner had always been his greatest fear, and yet, in this moment, his fear was inexplicably tangled with something else, a strange, hesitant curiosity. His body, though it screamed at him to move, remained frozen. The soldier could not bring himself to raise his weapon or to even turn and flee. Instead, his feet felt as if they were rooted to the ground, trapped by the weight of the moment. The British commander's eyes were calm as he studied the soldier. He made no immediate move, only observing him as though waiting for the soldier to make a decision. Time stretched out, and with each passing second, the tension seemed to grow heavier. The soldier's throat was dry, and his mind was clouded with conflicting thoughts. What did they want from him? Why hadn't they just shot him on sight, like he had expected? Was it possible that something other than animosity existed between soldiers, even in the midst of such a destructive conflict? This thought seemed almost absurd, like a fleeting dream that he couldn't hold on to. The soldiers around the commander shifted, their eyes no longer filled with the aggression that the soldier had anticipated, but with something akin to weariness. There was no eagerness to kill, no bloodlust. The soldier could not remember the last time he had seen men so tired, so drained of the kind of youthful enthusiasm that once defined the soldiers he had fought alongside. These men were not the invincible enemies of his imagination. They were human beings, worn down by the same forces that had ravaged his own life. For the briefest of moments, the soldier caught himself wondering what it might be like to be one of them. What was it like to wear the uniform of the enemy and stand in this shattered world, having endured the same devastation and pain that he himself had suffered? He had been taught to see them as the enemy, the ones who were intent on defeating his nation, on tearing down everything he had been told to protect. But now, standing before them, he saw only men who had been broken in the same ways he had. The realization was an unsettling one, and it left him feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way he had never experienced. The commander finally spoke, his voice low and calm. The words were in English, but the soldier barely understood them at first, his mind still caught in a whirlwind of thoughts. As the words filtered through his foggy brain, the soldier recognized the lack of hostility in them. The commander was not threatening him. He wasn't commanding him to surrender. Instead, his tone was matter-of-fact, almost like one soldier speaking to another. The soldier's mind struggled to grasp the meaning behind these words. What was happening? Why wasn't he being treated as an enemy? Why wasn't he being punished for surrendering, for abandoning his comrades? The British commander repeated himself, more slowly this time, as if he understood the soldier's confusion. He gestured for the soldier to step forward, his hand moving in an open, unthreatening gesture. There was no gun raised, no demand for compliance. In fact, the British soldiers seemed to be waiting for him to make his own decision, to choose his own fate in this strange moment. The soldier's legs felt like lead, his mind spinning in circles, unsure of what to do. Should he move toward them? Should he surrender fully? Could he trust them? These questions hammered against his consciousness, each one drowning out the others until he could barely think at all. The ground beneath him felt unsteady, the air thick with uncertainty. What the soldier didn't know was that this moment, this brief exchange, was not just a passing incident. It was a quiet turning point, one that would forever alter the course of his life. The British soldiers, who had been trained to fight without hesitation, were now showing him an unexpected humanity, a kindness that defied the very nature of the war they were engaged in. It was a kindness that seemed almost absurd in the context of the violence and hatred that had defined their conflict. And yet, in the heart of this shattered world, amidst the rubble and destruction, it was a kindness that spoke louder than the artillery fire or the cries of the dying. The soldier's thoughts continued to whirl, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was no longer trapped in the narrow confines of his fear. He was given a moment, however brief, to choose what he would do next. Would he surrender completely? Would he trust these men, these enemies, who had shown him a mercy he never thought possible? Or would he run, abandoning the fragile thread of connection that had formed between them? In that moment, the soldier knew one thing for certain. This was a choice that would define him. He could feel it deep within him, in the core of his being. The future, and everything that came with it, rested on the edge of this decision. The soldier's mind raced, his thoughts spiraling into a vortex of confusion and disbelief. The British soldiers, once enemies in his eyes, now stood before him, offering him something that he had never anticipated: kindness. Their eyes, weathered by the same horrors of war, were not filled with contempt or malice. Instead, there was an unsettling calmness to their presence, as though they, too, were caught in the same tempest of confusion that had gripped him. In this surreal moment, the soldier stood frozen, unsure of what to do or how to react. Every instinct he had was telling him to distrust them, to assume that this was a trick, a psychological game meant to break him. After all, hadn't he been conditioned to see the enemy as less than human, as mere obstacles to be destroyed? And yet, there was something different about these men. Something that made him question everything he had ever known about war, about his duty, and even about himself. The commander, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of countless battles, took a step closer. His movements were deliberate, slow, as though he was trying to convey something without words. The soldier could feel the heat of his gaze, steady and unwavering. The British man didn't look at him as if he were an enemy soldier, someone to be executed or imprisoned, but as a fellow human being who had been caught in the same horrific cycle of war. This realization was almost too much to bear. The soldier's chest tightened as he thought about the thousands of men he had killed, the families he had torn apart, the destruction he had wrought in the name of a cause that no longer seemed justifiable. Now, in front of him, stood men who had also experienced the same suffering, and yet they did not seem eager to exact revenge. Instead, they seemed willing to offer him something else, a chance for redemption, perhaps, or at least a sliver of humanity in a world that had lost both. The British soldiers exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves in low voices. The soldier couldn't understand their words, but it didn't matter. The tone wasn't one of hostility or aggression, but of something softer, more measured. They weren't planning his execution, as he had expected. They weren't even ordering him to surrender. They were waiting, patiently, as if giving him the space to make a decision. It felt as though they, too, were at the mercy of a situation that neither side had asked for, and they were simply doing the best they could to navigate it. The soldier's hands, which had been trembling with fear moments earlier, were now gripped tightly by his sides. His pulse was still racing, but there was something else beginning to surface, an uneasy sense of relief. The commander spoke again, his voice low and measured. He asked the soldier to drop his weapon. It wasn't a command, but rather a request, a suggestion. The soldier's mind screamed at him to resist, to hold on to his rifle, the only thing that had given him any sense of security in this chaotic world. It had been his lifeline, the tool that allowed him to survive. But now, in the face of these men who showed him no hostility, he felt the weight of the rifle growing heavier. It was as though the weapon itself had become a burden, a symbol of everything that was wrong with this war. The soldier hesitated, his fingers tightening around the grip of his rifle before he slowly, almost reluctantly, let it fall to the ground. The sound of it hitting the earth was deafening in the stillness of the moment. As the rifle hit the ground, the soldier felt a strange mixture of relief and fear. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was no longer holding onto the weapon that had defined him. He was no longer a soldier, at least not in the way he had understood it. He was a man, a broken man, standing in front of the men he had once considered his enemies. The commander didn't move immediately, but there was something in his gaze that made the soldier feel as though he had just taken a step toward something new, something beyond the battlefield. The moment stretched, hanging in the air like the stillness before a storm. The soldiers around him didn't speak, but their expressions softened as the soldier took another tentative step forward, his feet moving of their own accord. He felt as though he was walking through a dream, where the rules of reality had been temporarily suspended. Every step felt like a betrayal, yet it was also a step toward something he couldn't quite name, something that felt both liberating and terrifying. He had always been told that surrender was a sign of weakness, a failure to uphold the honor of his country. But standing here, in front of men who had once been his enemies, he realized how hollow those teachings had been. In this strange, fragile moment, the concept of honor seemed distant, irrelevant even. What mattered now was survival, not as a soldier, but as a human being. The commander motioned for him to follow, and without fully understanding why, the soldier obeyed. It wasn't that he was afraid, not exactly. It was more that, for the first time in a long while, he felt as though he had no other choice. The soldiers began to lead him away from the broken village, their pace steady and calm. He followed them, his steps heavy, as though he were walking through a fog. The sound of his boots on the ground seemed too loud in the silence between them, but no one spoke. It was as if the soldier's presence, his surrender, had opened up a space where words were unnecessary. The journey, though short, felt endless. Each step he took was a step away from the world he had known, away from the violence that had defined his existence. And yet, it also felt like a step toward something else, a place where he might find a way to reconcile the person he had been with the man he was becoming. As they walked, the soldier's mind drifted back to the war, to the countless faces of men he had seen fall, to the screams of pain and the stench of death that had become all too familiar. He thought about his family back home, about the life he had left behind, and about the dreams he once had before the war had shattered everything. He had never imagined that he would be standing here, in the midst of a conflict he no longer understood, feeling so utterly lost. The war had consumed everything: his youth, his innocence, and his sense of self. And yet, in this moment, as he walked in silence behind the British soldiers, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: the faintest glimmer of hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. For the first time since the war had begun, he allowed himself to think that maybe there was a future beyond the battlefield. Maybe there was a way to escape the cycle of violence and destruction that had become his reality. They arrived at a small camp, its tents nestled in the shadow of a ruined building. The soldier was led inside, and the men around him began to settle into their routine. No one made a big deal of his presence. No one raised their voices, no one jeered or mocked him. It was as though his surrender, his humanity, had been accepted without question. The soldiers moved about their tasks with the same quiet determination that had characterized their every action since the war began. The soldier watched them, still uncertain, still afraid of what would come next. But slowly, as the hours passed, he began to realize that they were not his captors. They were not the enemy anymore. They were simply men, soldiers who had been forced into the same war, the same struggle, that he had been. And in that understanding, the soldier began to feel the weight of his own surrender lift. For the first time in years, he wasn't fighting. He was simply surviving. And in that fragile peace, he found something he had long thought lost: his humanity. The days that followed felt surreal to the soldier. After the quiet surrender, after the British soldiers had taken him in with an unsettling calmness, everything began to blur into something resembling an uncertain peace. The camp, a humble collection of tents and makeshift structures hidden behind the remnants of a broken wall, became his refuge. He wasn't treated like a prisoner. He wasn't mocked or abused. He wasn't interrogated, nor was he forced to perform menial tasks as punishment. The soldiers around him went about their duties as if his presence was nothing more than a footnote in their war-weary existence. At times, he found himself watching them, bewildered by their normalcy, and wondering whether he would ever understand the logic behind it. In the early hours of the morning, when the camp was still shrouded in mist, he would sit in silence, watching the soldiers perform their daily routines. They moved with the same quiet precision as any soldier would, but their actions lacked the tension and urgency that marked their previous encounters. They were tired, yes, but there was something different about them. Something that stood in stark contrast to the brutal, mechanical rhythm he had once followed. There was no anger in their eyes, no hatred. Instead, they moved with a kind of exhaustion, the result of too many years of violence, too many lives lost, too many battles fought. It was the kind of tiredness that could only be born from an endless conflict, one that had stripped away the idealism and zeal of youth, leaving only the raw, undiluted reality of war behind. The soldier couldn't help but feel the weight of their shared experience, even though they had been on opposing sides. He watched as they sat around small fires at night, sharing what little food they had, exchanging stories, and talking about the families they had left behind. The laughter, though sparse and hollow, was a reminder of the life they had once known, a life untouched by the horrors of war. The soldiers joked about the absurdity of it all, the endless cycle of violence that seemed to drag everyone into its maw, chewing them up and spitting them out without any regard for what was left behind. But even in their jokes, there was a kind of bitterness, an unspoken understanding that there was no real escape from the war, no matter how much they tried to forget it. The soldier had been given food and a place to rest, but what struck him the most was the lack of hostility he had anticipated. They didn't look at him as an enemy. They didn't treat him like a defeated foe. They treated him as a man. They treated him like one of their own, not because of any political or moral stance, but because they understood the shared suffering that had brought them all to this point. They had all been broken by war, all been stripped of their innocence, their beliefs, and their futures. This was not a time for judgment. It was a time for survival. The soldier's nights were filled with restless sleep, his dreams haunted by the faces of the men he had once fought alongside, by the faces of those he had killed. He could still hear the screams, the chaos, the deafening sound of gunfire that had been the soundtrack of his life for as long as he could remember. But each morning, as the sun crept over the horizon, he would wake up to find the British soldiers carrying on with their work, the steady hum of their voices reminding him that, for better or worse, life continued. It was a reminder that there was more to existence than the war. There was a world beyond the battlefield. But could he ever return to it? Was there any place for him in that world now that he had been so irrevocably changed? As the days passed, the soldier began to notice the small gestures of kindness from the men around him. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was enough to make him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. One soldier, an older man with a graying beard, shared his rations with him without asking for anything in return. Another soldier, a young man not much older than the soldier himself, offered him a cigarette and sat with him in silence as if to say, "I don't know what you've been through, but I see you." It was these small acts, these silent exchanges, that began to tear down the walls the soldier had so carefully constructed around himself. In the company of these men, he began to realize that war, for all its brutality, was not the only thing that defined him. There was still humanity left in him, still the capacity for connection, for understanding, for empathy. It was not gone, despite everything he had witnessed, despite everything he had done. One evening, as the soldiers gathered around a fire, the soldier found himself pulled into their conversations. He sat quietly, listening as they spoke about their homes, their families, their lives before the war. Some spoke of distant lovers they longed to return to, others spoke of children they had never seen grow up. It was a strange, bittersweet exchange. The soldier could feel the weight of their longing, the deep ache in their voices as they spoke of the lives they had left behind. He wanted to say something, to share his own story, but the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly say? How could he explain the things he had done, the choices he had made? How could he explain the guilt that gnawed at him, the shame that had settled into the marrow of his bones? But as the night wore on, something shifted. The soldier felt himself drawn into the warmth of the fire, into the rhythm of the conversation. It wasn't as though his past had been erased, or that the war had been forgotten. But for the first time in a long time, he felt as though he was a part of something larger than himself, something that wasn't defined by the uniforms they wore, by the weapons they carried, or by the nations they represented. They were just men, trying to survive, trying to find meaning in a world that had lost its meaning. The soldier began to speak, hesitantly at first, but then more freely. He told them about his home, about the family he had left behind, about the things he had seen and done during the war. There was no judgment in their eyes, only a quiet understanding. They didn't need to hear his confession. They didn't need him to justify himself. They just needed him to be human, just as they were. The soldier's life in the camp became a series of small, quiet revelations. He began to feel less like an outsider and more like a member of a strange, fractured community. The soldiers, though battle-worn and weary, treated him with respect, even camaraderie. He was still an enemy, technically, but the line between enemy and friend had blurred in a way that left him confused but also strangely comforted. These men, who had once been his adversaries, were now his companions. They shared their stories, their fears, and their hopes, and in doing so, they gave him something that felt like hope, a hope for a future that wasn't defined by violence, a hope for redemption, even if it seemed impossible. But the soldier's thoughts were often interrupted by the haunting memories of his past. He couldn't escape the ghosts of the war that still lingered in the corners of his mind. The faces of the men he had killed, the faces of the families he had torn apart, haunted him in every quiet moment. He couldn't shake the guilt that weighed heavily on his heart, and yet, as he sat by the fire with the British soldiers, he began to feel a strange sense of acceptance. The guilt would never disappear. The war would never leave him. But perhaps there was a way forward, a way to make peace with the past, however broken it was. As the days turned into weeks, the soldier found himself slipping into a new rhythm, one that was defined by small moments of connection rather than the grand narratives of war and nation. The British soldiers had shown him something that, at first, he could not fathom, an alternative to the brutality of war. They had shown him that, even in the face of death, there was still room for kindness, for compassion, for humanity. And in that realization, the soldier began to see that, perhaps, he could find his own way back to some semblance of peace. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. But for the first time in a long time, he could imagine a future beyond the war. And that, in itself, was enough to keep him moving forward. The days in the British camp began to blend together in a way that felt both disorienting and comforting to the soldier. As the hours stretched into weeks, the rhythm of camp life settled around him, like a cocoon he hadn't realized he was seeking. His thoughts, once consumed by the crushing weight of the war and the endless barrage of violence he had witnessed, began to shift ever so slowly. There was no grand epiphany, no singular moment of clarity. It wasn't a sudden awakening. It was more like the slow, steady unfolding of a new reality, one where his existence was not defined by his role as a soldier, but by the simple, fragile humanity he was now learning to embrace. He found himself growing accustomed to the sight of British soldiers moving around him, cooking meals, tending to their weapons, making the best of their circumstances. They were not heroes. They were not saviors. They were simply men who had endured too much to carry the weight of ideals and nationalistic pride with any real conviction. They were, like him, scarred by war, and in that shared suffering, they had found an unspoken bond. It was a bond that transcended uniforms, flags, and national lines, something deeper and more raw, a recognition of the sheer absurdity of what they had all been part of. The soldier noticed that the soldiers around him never seemed to ask him about his past. There was no interrogation, no desire to understand why he had fought for the German army, no demand for explanations or confessions. They did not seek to make him feel guilty, nor did they treat him like a monster. It was as if, in the brutal and often senseless nature of war, they had come to a collective understanding. Every man who fought in this conflict had blood on his hands, whether through direct action or by supporting a cause that led to destruction. The British soldiers, though weary and jaded by the war, seemed to understand this. There was a quiet acknowledgement that their lives, too, had been irreparably changed by the war. In that shared experience, the soldier found himself accepted, not as an enemy, but simply as a fellow man who had been lost in the same storm of violence.